Bikers insult a disabled veteran, not knowing a royal guard was watching. The early morning sun bathed the royal palace in a warm, golden light. Its towering gates, intricately designed with crests and emblems of a storied monarchy, stood as a symbol of tradition, pride, and honor. Frank Lawson, an 82-year-old disabled veteran, sat patiently in his wheelchair just outside the gates. His military uniform was immaculate, his medals gleaming under the sunlight like a constellation of bravery pinned to his chest. For Frank, this day was more than just an honor. It was a testament to a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to his country. Frank had always been punctual, arriving early to every event as a personal rule. He believed it was a sign of respect, not only for the occasion but for the people involved. Today, he had been invited to the palace to receive recognition for his years of dedicated service during a special ceremony hosted by the royal family. Staff moved with a sense of purpose, their crisp uniforms and organized demeanor reflecting the importance of the event. Guards stood at attention, their watchful eyes scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. Frank smiled softly as a young boy walked by with his mother, pointing excitedly at the veteran's medals. "Mom, look! He's a soldier!" the boy exclaimed, tugging at his mother's sleeve. Frank nodded politely, giving the boy a small wave. Moments like these, where the younger generation showed admiration for service, filled his heart with quiet pride. Yet, even as he savored the peaceful ambience of the morning, Frank couldn't shake a lingering feeling. As he adjusted his hat, the faint rumble of motorcycle engines began to echo in the distance. The sound grew louder, breaking the serenity of the palace courtyard. Frank turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the road ahead. A group of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, their gleaming chrome catching the sunlight. The motorcycles came to a stop just beyond the palace gates, their riders dismounting with an air of brash confidence. There were 5 of them in total, each clad in worn leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias. At the center of the group stood Jax, the leader, a tall and broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a cruel grin that seemed permanently etched on his face. His presence radiated authority, though it was the kind earned through intimidation rather than respect. "Well, what do we have here?" Jax said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery as he caught sight of Frank. He nudged one of his companions, Blake, a wiry young man with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Check out Grandpa over there, all dressed up for story time." The group laughed, their voices carrying across the courtyard. They began walking toward Frank, their heavy boots clunking against the cobblestone path. Frank didn't flinch. Years of military service had taught him the value of composure in the face of adversity. Instead, he kept his gaze forward, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair. "Hey, old man," Blake called out, leaning closer. "What's with all the shiny medals? Did they give those out for surviving nap time?" The group erupted into laughter again, the sound grating against the dignified atmosphere of the palace grounds. A few passers-by paused to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Frank remained silent, his calm demeanor unnerving the bikers more than any angry retort could. "Come on, Gramps," Jack sneered, stepping closer. "Don't you have anything to say? Or are you just another museum exhibit?" Frank finally turned to face them, his hazel eyes sharp and unwavering. "Each of these medals has a story," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And those stories represent sacrifices you couldn't possibly understand." For a brief moment, Jax faltered, caught off guard by the veteran's unwavering confidence. But his ego quickly reasserted itself, and he barked out another laugh. "Big words for a guy who can't even stand up," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Unbeknownst to the bikers, a pair of watchful eyes had been following their every move. Sergeant Hayes, a royal guard stationed near the gates, had been observing the situation from the moment the bikers arrived. Hayes was a man of few words but immense presence, his sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Clad in the signature red and black uniform of the Royal Guards, he carried himself with a quiet authority that could command a room without a single spoken word. Hayes's jaw tightened as he watched the bikers' behavior. He had seen men like them before, bullies who mistook noise for power and intimidation for respect. But what they didn't know was that they were on royal grounds, and their actions wouldn't go unchecked. The guard stepped back toward his post, his movements deliberate and subtle. Using a discreet communication device, Hayes radioed his colleagues inside the palace. "This is Hayes at Gate B. We've got a situation outside. Stand by for instructions." Back at the scene, Jax and his gang were growing bolder. They circled Frank like predators, their laughter echoing across the courtyard. Blake reached out as if to touch one of the medals on Frank's chest, but before his hand could make contact, Frank spoke again. "Do you think this makes you strong?" Frank asked, his voice calm but piercing. "Mocking someone you don't understand? Let me tell you something, son. Real strength isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting them up." The words hung in the air, cutting through the biker's bravado like a blade. For a moment, an uneasy silence fell over the group. Jax's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, unwilling to let an old man get the better of him. "You've got a lot to say for someone sitting down," Jax snapped, his tone laced with frustration. "Why don't you?" "Enough," a voice interrupted, sharp and commanding. All heads turned toward the source. Sergeant Hayes had stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones as he approached. The sunlight caught the gleam of his ceremonial sword, a silent reminder of the authority he carried. Hayes stopped a few feet away from the bikers, his steely gaze locking onto Jax. "Step away from the guest of honor," Hayes said, his voice low but filled with authority. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation finally dawning on them. Jax tried to muster a retort, but the words died in his throat as Hayes took another step closer. The tension was thick, the air charged with anticipation. Frank watched the scene unfold, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had faced far worse in his lifetime, but seeing a man like Hayes step in on his behalf was a reminder that dignity and honor would always prevail over arrogance and ignorance. The biker stood frozen for a moment, taken aback by Sergeant Hayes' sudden appearance. His commanding presence alone was enough to make most men think twice about their actions, but Jax wasn't like most men. He lived for confrontation, thrived on it, and even now, he saw an opportunity to assert his dominance. Jax stepped forward, his leather boots scuffing against the cobblestones, his smirk returning as he tried to regain control of the situation. "And who are you supposed to be? The palace babysitter?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Hayes didn't flinch. He kept his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "You're on royal grounds," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Your behavior is not only disrespectful, it's unacceptable." But Jax wasn't ready to back down. He crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Royal grounds, huh? So what, you're gonna lock us up for having a little fun?" He turned to his gang, his voice rising in mockery. "Look at this guy, acting like he's the king himself." The gang burst into laughter, their voices echoing across the courtyard. A few onlookers paused to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Hayes remained still, his sharp blue eyes fixed on Jax. He could feel the tension in the air, but he wasn't about to let the situation escalate any further. "Let me make this clear," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the biker's laughter. "This man," he gestured to Frank, "is a guest of honor. You will treat him with the respect he deserves, or you will face the consequences." Blake, emboldened by Jax's defiance, stepped forward, his sneer matching his leader's. "And what consequences are those?" he taunted, his voice laced with bravado. "You gonna call the queen? Have us thrown in the dungeon?" The bikers laughed again, but their amusement was short-lived. Hayes took a deliberate step closer, his posture unyielding. "You've already crossed the line," he said, his voice steady. "But I'll give you one last chance. Leave now or you'll be escorted off the premises, and trust me, you don't want that." Jax's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly recovered, his ego unwilling to admit defeat. He turned back to Frank, who had been silently observing the exchange with his characteristic calm. "What's the big deal with you anyway, old man?" Jax asked, his tone mocking. "Why is everyone treating you like royalty?" Frank met Jax's gaze, his hazel eyes unwavering. Because they understand the value of service, he replied quietly. Something you clearly don't. The simple statement hit harder than any insult could have. For a moment, Jack seemed at a loss for words, his arrogance challenged by Frank's quiet dignity. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising in frustration. You think you're better than me, old man? Sitting there with your shiny medals like you're some kind of hero? Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, the weight of his presence speaking louder than any words could. Finally, he said, I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I've earned these medals. Can you say the same about anything in your life? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, the bikers seemed unsure of themselves. Jax opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the gates of the palace swung open. The sound of the gates opening drew everyone's attention. A group of royal guards marched out with precision, their polished uniforms gleaming in the sunlight. Their synchronized movements and stern expressions left no room for misinterpretation. This was a show of authority, and it was not to be taken lightly. The guards formed a protective semicircle around Frank, their presence a silent but powerful statement of respect and protection. The bikers watched in stunned silence, their earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of the guards' disciplined formation. The lead guard stepped forward, bowing slightly toward Frank. Mr. Lawson, he said, his voice filled with respect. The royal family is ready to receive you. Frank nodded, a faint smile gracing his lips. Thank you, he said simply. As the guards prepared to escort Frank into the palace, Jax found his voice again. We were just joking around, he said, his tone defensive. Didn't mean anything by it. Hayes turned to Jax, his expression unyielding. There's a difference between a joke and disrespect, he said. And you crossed that line a long time ago. Jax bristled but didn't respond. He knew better than to push his luck any further. The other bikers stood awkwardly, their earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Frank glanced at Jax one last time before turning his wheelchair toward the palace gates. Respect isn't something you demand, he said. It's something you earn. Maybe one day you'll understand that. With that, Frank was escorted through the gates, the guards flanking him like an honor guard. The bikers were left standing in the courtyard, their arrogance replaced by a mix of shame and humiliation. As the scene unfolded, more onlookers had gathered, drawn by the unusual commotion outside the palace. Whispers spread through the crowd, their curiosity piqued by the presence of the royal guards and the unusual confrontation. Who is he? Someone asked, pointing to Frank as he disappeared through the gates. He's a veteran, another replied. Looks like he's being honored today. And the bikers? A third person chimed in. What were they doing? The murmurs grew louder, the crowd's disapproval of the bikers' behavior becoming increasingly apparent. The bikers felt the weight of the stares, their earlier confidence now a distant memory. Jax tried to shake it off, forcing a smirk as he turned to his gang. Let's get out of here, he muttered, his voice lacking its usual bravado. But as they mounted their bikes, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. You should be ashamed of yourselves, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Mocking a man who's done more for this country than you ever will. The crowd murmured in agreement, their disapproval palpable. Jax clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He revved his engine, signaling for the others to follow. One by one, the bikers rode off, their departure a quiet retreat rather than the triumphant exit they had likely envisioned. As the bikers disappeared down the road, Sergeant Hayes watched them go, his expression unreadable. He turned back to the gates, where the last of the royal guards were filing inside after escorting Frank. Hayes felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just from diffusing the situation but from seeing a man like Frank receive the respect he deserved. Hayes adjusted his hat, his gaze lingering on the now quiet courtyard. He knew men like Jax, bullies who mistook noise for power and arrogance for strength. Frank's wheelchair rolled smoothly across the polished marble floors of the palace's grand hall. The magnificence of the place was overwhelming, towering columns adorned with gold accents, intricate chandeliers sparkling overhead, and walls lined with portraits of monarchs past. Yet, despite the grandeur, Frank's focus remained steady. Today was not about the splendor of the surroundings, but the recognition of a life devoted to service. The royal guards flanked him as they led the way to the central chamber, where members of the royal family awaited. Along the route, staff and dignitaries paused in their tasks, offering respectful nods and warm smiles. Frank acknowledged them with a polite nod, though he couldn't help but feel a touch of nervousness. His humility made him question whether he truly deserved all this attention. As they approached the chamber, the grand double doors opened to reveal an expansive room filled with elegantly dressed guests. At the center of it all stood the royal family, their presence commanding yet welcoming. The crowd fell silent, their attention drawn to Frank as he entered. The moment was surreal, and for a brief second, Frank's normally steady composure wavered. "Mr. Lawson," a deep, warm voice greeted. It was Prince Edward, a tall figure with a kind smile. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's an honor to have you here today. On behalf of the royal family and the nation, I thank you for your service." Frank shook the prince's hand, his grip firm despite his age. "The honor is mine, Your Highness," he replied, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I served because it was my duty, not for recognition." The prince smiled. "That humility is precisely why you deserve this moment." As the prince stepped aside, the queen herself approached. Dressed in a regal yet understated gown, she radiated grace. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice gentle but commanding, "your courage and dedication have inspired generations. Today, we honor not just your service but the values you represent: honor, integrity, and resilience." Frank felt a lump in his throat as he bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I'm deeply grateful." The room erupted into applause as Frank was guided to a platform at the front of the chamber. On a nearby table rested a beautifully crafted medal, specially commissioned for the ceremony. As the queen prepared to present it, a dignitary stepped forward to recount Frank's accomplishments. "Mr. Lawson served with distinction during one of the most challenging conflicts of our time," the dignitary began. "His bravery in the face of danger, his commitment to his comrades, and his unwavering sense of duty embody the very best of what it means to serve." As the dignitary spoke, images of Frank's past flashed through his mind: the camaraderie of his unit, the harsh realities of war, and the bittersweet mix of triumph and loss. He had endured so much, not for glory but because he believed in protecting the freedom of others. Today, hearing his story told to a room of strangers, Frank felt a deep sense of validation. The queen stepped forward, the medal in her hands. "With this, we honor your sacrifices and celebrate the legacy you leave for future generations," she said as she placed the medal around Frank's neck. The applause was thunderous, and for the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to shed a tear. As the ceremony continued, Frank sat quietly, absorbing the moment. The speeches, the applause, and the heartfelt gratitude of the royal family were overwhelming, but what struck him most was the respect he felt in the room. It wasn't about grandeur or pomp, it was about acknowledgement. In this moment, he felt seen, not as an old man in a wheelchair but as a man who had lived a life of purpose. His thoughts wandered briefly to the bikers outside. Their taunts had been cruel, but Frank harbored no resentment. Instead, he felt a sense of pity for them. They hadn't lived long enough or experienced enough to understand the depth of the values he held dear. Perhaps today's events would teach them something. Frank believed in redemption. After all, he had seen it time and again during his years of service. Later, as the formalities wound down, Sergeant Hayes was escorted into the chamber. Spotting Frank across the room, he approached with a smile, pausing to bow respectfully to the royal family before addressing the veteran. "Mr. Lawson," Hayes said, his tone warm but professional. "It's good to see you here where you belong, among those who respect your service." Frank chuckled softly. "I owe you for stepping in earlier. Those boys didn't know what they were dealing with." Hayes nodded. "I've seen their kind before. Loud, brash, and looking for attention. But they left with a lesson today, and I think it'll stick." Frank's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I hope so. They've got potential, they just don't know how to use it yet." The two men shared a laugh, a brief but meaningful connection forming between them. For Hayes, Frank represented everything he aspired to be: honorable, composed, and steadfast. For Frank, Hayes symbolized the next generation of protectors, carrying forward the values he had lived by. As the event came to an end, Frank was presented with a small, handwritten note from the Queen herself. It read, "To Mr. Frank Lawson, your bravery and sacrifice have not gone unnoticed. You remind us all of what it means to truly serve. May this day be a reminder of the profound gratitude this nation holds for you. With deepest respect, Elizabeth R." Frank folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried immense weight. The applause, the speeches, the medal, all of it paled in comparison to this personal acknowledgement. As he was wheeled out of the chamber, Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world outside awaited, filled with its usual challenges and noise, but for now, Frank carried with him the quiet dignity of knowing he had lived a life worth honoring. Outside the palace gates, the bikers lingered in awkward silence. The crowd that had gathered earlier still watched them, murmuring among themselves. The weight of their earlier actions began to sink in, and even the boldest among them, Jax, could feel the disapproving stares burning into his back. Blake shifted uncomfortably, kicking at the cobblestones with the toe of his boot. "This is stupid," he muttered. "We didn't do anything wrong." "You call mocking a veteran nothing wrong?" an elderly woman from the crowd said, her voice sharp. She stood with arms crossed, her piercing gaze fixed on Blake. "Shame on you." Blake flushed and looked away, his bravado crumbling. Jax, however, refused to acknowledge the tension. He crossed his arms and leaned against his motorcycle, trying to project an air of defiance. "Who cares what they think?" Jax said loudly, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's just a bunch of posh people worshipping some old guy. You don't get it, do you?" A young man in the crowd called out, stepping forward. He wore a simple suit and had a kind face, but his tone was firm. "That old guy is more of a man than you'll ever be. He earned his respect, and you just made fools of yourselves." The crowd murmured in agreement, their disdain for the bikers growing more vocal. Jax's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk. "Big talk coming from someone who doesn't know me," he shot back. "Why don't you mind your own business?" The young man didn't back down. "It's everyone's business when you disrespect someone like that. You think you're tough, but all I see is a coward hiding behind noise and intimidation." The bikers' tension escalated as the crowd's disapproval grew. Just when it seemed Jax might lose his tenuous grip on the situation, the palace gates opened once again. This time, it wasn't Frank or the royal family who emerged but Sergeant Hayes, flanked by 2 other royal guards. Hayes's sharp blue eyes scanned the scene, immediately assessing the situation. His presence alone silenced the bikers and subdued the crowd, his commanding aura cutting through the chaos like a knife. Hayes walked purposefully toward Jax, stopping just a few feet away. His stance was calm but firm, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones with every step. "Still here?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "I thought you might have learned your lesson." Jax straightened, his smirk returning, though it looked forced. "We were just leaving," he said, his tone flippant. "Didn't realize it was a crime to hang around." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "It's not a crime to be here," he said. "But disrespecting a veteran, especially one who's being honored by the royal family, is another matter entirely." Blake shifted nervously. "We didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, glancing at the other bikers. "We were just joking around." "A joke?" Hayes repeated, his tone icy. "Tell me, did it feel like a joke to him? Or to the people watching?" Blake opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it, his gaze dropping to the ground. Jax, however, refused to back down. He stepped closer to Hayes, his arrogance rearing its head once more. "And what are you gonna do about it?" he challenged. "We're not on palace grounds anymore. You don't have any power here." Hayes didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his imposing figure towering over Jax. "You've already made a spectacle of yourselves," he said evenly. "You've insulted a man who's done more for this country than you could ever imagine. And now you're standing here, trying to justify it." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in support of Hayes. Jax glanced around, his confidence wavering as he realized just how outnumbered he was. Hayes's tone softened slightly, but his words carried even more weight. "Do you even know what those medals mean?" he asked, his gaze locking onto Jack's. "Every single one represents a sacrifice. Nights spent in freezing trenches, battles fought against impossible odds, lives lost for the sake of others." Jax faltered, his smirk disappearing. The other bikers looked at one another, their discomfort growing. Even Blake, who had been the most vocal earlier, seemed shaken by Hayes's words. "He didn't have to come here today," Hayes continued. "He could have stayed home, kept his stories to himself, and let the world move on. But he didn't. He showed up because he believed it was important for people to remember the cost of freedom. And you mocked him for it." The silence was deafening. Jax looked away, unable to meet Hayes's piercing gaze. The weight of his actions began to settle on him, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Before anyone could speak, the gates opened again, and Frank himself appeared, now flanked by 2 guards. The crowd parted to let him through, their respectful silence a stark contrast to the bikers' earlier jeers. Frank's presence was commanding, not because of his stature. He sat calmly in his wheelchair, but because of the quiet dignity that surrounded him. He stopped a few feet from the bikers, his hazel eyes meeting Jax's. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "I heard you had something to say to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "So go ahead. Say it." Jax hesitated, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked at his gang for support, but they were as silent as the crowd. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "We were wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We shouldn't have said what we did." Frank tilted his head, studying Jax carefully. "You're right," he said. "You shouldn't have. But what matters now is whether you'll learn from it." Jax looked down, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'll try," he said quietly. Frank nodded, his expression softening. "That's all anyone can ask." As Frank was wheeled back toward the palace, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't just for him, it was for the moment of redemption, however small, that had unfolded before them. The bikers stood in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by a sense of humility. Hayes turned to the group one last time. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Respect isn't about words, it's about actions. Earn it." With that, he turned and followed Frank toward the gates, leaving the bikers to reflect on the day's events. As they mounted their motorcycles and rode away, they carried with them the weight of a lesson they would never forget. The hum of the bikers' engines filled the air as they rode away from the palace grounds. Unlike their earlier arrival, marked by loud laughter and brash arrogance, their departure was silent and subdued. Jax led the group, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses, while the others followed closely, exchanging glances of unease. The events of the morning had shaken them, though none were willing to say it out loud. After several minutes on the road, Jax signaled for the group to pull over at a small roadside cafe. They parked their bikes and dismounted, the usual swagger in their movements noticeably absent. Blake, who had been unusually quiet, finally broke the silence as they sat down at a table. "What just happened back there?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "That old guy and that guard. They made us look like idiots." "We were idiots," muttered Mason, the quietest member of the gang. His comment drew surprised looks from the others, but he didn't back down. "Think about it. What did we even gain by mocking that guy?" "Nothing," Blake bristled. "We were just having fun," he argued, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's not like we hurt anyone." Jax leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He wasn't used to feeling this way, unsettled, unsure of himself. The words of Sergeant Hayes and Frank Lawson echoed in his mind, chipping away at the defenses he had built over years of trying to prove himself. "You think he was lying?" Jax asked suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence at the table. The others looked at him in confusion. "Who?" Blake asked. "Frank," Jax replied, his voice quieter than usual. "That stuff he said about his medals? You think he was making it up?" Mason shook his head. Why would he? A guy like that doesn't need to prove anything to us. He's already lived his life, done more than we ever will. Blake frowned but didn't argue. Deep down, he knew Mason was right. Frank's quiet confidence, the way he had carried himself despite their taunts, had been humbling. The contrast between their arrogance and his dignity was glaring. You saw how everyone looked at him. Mason continued. Not just the royal family, but the crowd. They respected him because he earned it. And what do we have? A bunch of bikes and loud mouths. Jax leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. So what are you saying? That we've been wasting our time? That we're just a bunch of losers? Mason hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I guess I am. But that doesn't mean we have to stay that way. Jax looked at Mason, his jaw tightening. He didn't like admitting when someone else was right, but today had left him questioning everything. The words of Sergeant Hayes lingered in his mind. Respect isn't about words, it's about actions. What do we even do? Jax asked, his voice almost a whisper. How do you start earning respect when all you've done is screw around? The question hung in the air, heavy with vulnerability. For the first time, the bikers saw a side of Jax they had never witnessed before, doubt. He had always been their leader, the one who seemed unshakable. Seeing him like this made them realize that maybe they weren't the only ones questioning their choices. We start by doing something real, Mason said after a long pause. Something that actually helps people. Blake raised an eyebrow. Like what? Handing out medals? No, Mason said firmly. But maybe something like that charity ride we skipped last month. Remember? It was to raise money for veterans. Jax scoffed, though it was half-hearted. We don't do stuff like that. Maybe it's time we did, Mason replied. You saw what that guy's life meant to people. Don't you want something like that for yourself? Meanwhile, back at the palace, Frank sat in the quiet of a side chamber, sipping tea and reflecting on the events of the day. The grandeur of the ceremony had been overwhelming, but his thoughts kept returning to the bikers. He didn't harbor any ill will toward them. In fact, he hoped the confrontation had planted a seed of reflection. Sergeant Hayes entered the room, his posture relaxed but attentive. Enjoying a moment of peace? He asked. Frank chuckled softly. Trying to, though I can't stop thinking about those boys. Do you think they'll learn anything from today? Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I think they already have. Whether they act on it is another story, but you gave them something to think about. Sometimes that's all it takes. Frank leaned back in his chair, his hazel eyes thoughtful. I've seen a lot of men like them, he said. Lost, trying to prove themselves in all the wrong ways. But they've got potential. They just need to find the right path. Hayes smiled. You have more faith in people than most. Faith is what got me through the war, Frank replied. It's what keeps me going now. The bikers sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jax spoke, his tone more determined than before. Fine, he said. We'll do it. That charity ride Mason was talking about. If we're gonna prove we're not just a bunch of idiots, we've gotta start somewhere. Blake looked skeptical but didn't argue. The morning's events had left him shaken, and he wasn't ready to let his pride get in the way of change. Are we really doing this? He asked, looking between Jax and Mason. Jax nodded. Yeah, we are. And this time, we're not just showing up to look cool. We're doing it right. Mason smiled, a rare expression of pride crossing his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. As the sun began to set, Frank was escorted back to his car, his medal gleaming against his chest. The palace staff and guards lined up to bid him farewell, their respect evident in their warm smiles and heartfelt words. Frank thanked each one, his humility shining through even in this moment of recognition. Before he climbed into the car, he turned to Hayes. If you ever see those boys again, he said, tell them I'm rooting for them. Hayes nodded. I will, sir. And I think they'll surprise you. Frank smiled. I hope so. As the car pulled away from the palace, Frank leaned back, a sense of peace settling over him. Today has been a day of honor, reflection, and quiet victories. And though the bikers had left the palace gates with their heads low, Frank believed that perhaps, just perhaps, their journey to redemption had begun. Days passed since the confrontation outside the palace, but the impact of that morning lingered for everyone involved. For Frank, it was a moment of closure, a chance to see his sacrifices acknowledged and his values honored. For Jax and his gang, it was a reckoning, a wake-up call that forced them to reevaluate not just their actions but their entire outlook on life. The sound of motorcycles once again filled the air, but this time, the destination wasn't a palace or a rowdy roadside bar. Jax and his gang arrived at a community center on the outskirts of town, where a group of veterans was hosting a charity ride to raise money for injured servicemen and women. The atmosphere was lively, filled with the rumble of bikes and the chatter of volunteers. The bikers parked their motorcycles and stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure of their welcome. Mason took the lead, approaching an older man in a military jacket who was organizing the event. "Hi," Mason said hesitantly. "We're here to help, if you'll have us." The man looked them over, his expression skeptical but not unkind. "You boys looking to join the ride?" he asked. Jack stepped forward, his usual bravado replaced by something more genuine. "Not just the ride. We want to help however we can. Setting up, cleaning, whatever you need." The man studied them for a moment before extending a hand. "Name's Earl. Glad to have you on board." Relief washed over the group as they shook hands with Earl, who quickly put them to work. For the first time in years, they found themselves contributing to something meaningful. It wasn't glamorous work, setting up tables, moving supplies, and directing traffic, but it was honest. And with each task completed, they felt a small piece of their fractured pride start to mend. Back at his modest home, Frank sat by the window, sipping tea and enjoying the quiet of the afternoon. His thoughts often returned to the bikers and the confrontation outside the palace. He hoped they had taken something from the experience, but he also knew that change was never guaranteed. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Sergeant Hayes standing there, a smile on his face. "Sergeant," Frank greeted warmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Hayes stepped inside, a sense of excitement about him. "I thought you'd like to know what those boys have been up to." Frank raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Hayes explained how the bikers had shown up at the Veterans Charity Ride, not just to participate but to help. He recounted how they'd spent the entire day working alongside the volunteers, even staying late to help clean up after the event. "They've been back twice since," Hayes added. "And from what I hear, they're planning a ride of their own to raise funds for local veteran housing." Frank listened intently, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "They're turning it around." Hayes nodded. "Looks like you got through to them, sir. Your words, and your example, did more than you might have realized." The bikers' transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was genuine. They continued to volunteer at veteran events, each visit chipping away at the rough edges of their reputations. Jax, in particular, found himself reflecting on Frank's words often. He wanted to prove, to himself and others, that he was capable of more than just causing trouble. Months later, the gang organized their first charity ride. Riders from all over the region showed up to participate, the proceeds going to a local organization that provided therapy and housing for injured veterans. The event was a resounding success, and for the first time, Jax felt a sense of pride that wasn't tied to intimidation or bravado. As the ride came to an end, Jax stood before the crowd, holding a microphone with trembling hands. "I just want to say thank you," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "To the veterans who've served this country and to everyone who came out today to support them. We've got a long way to go, but we're learning what it means to earn respect, and it starts by giving it." The crowd erupted into applause, and for Jax, it was a moment he would never forget. Frank heard about the charity ride from Hayes and read about it in the local paper. As he sat in his favorite chair, the article in his hands, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change anyone's life that day outside the palace, but knowing that his example had sparked something in those young men filled him with quiet pride. The phone rang, and when Frank answered, Hayes' voice came through. You'll never guess who just dropped off a thank you letter for you. Let me guess, Frank said with a chuckle. Jax and his crew? You got it, Hayes replied. They said they're working on something big and wanted you to know it's because of you. Frank shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. Tell them they're welcome, and tell them I'm proud of them. As the sun set on another day, Frank sat by the window, watching the golden light fade into dusk. Life had taught him many lessons, but one stood out above all. True strength wasn't about power or noise. It was about character, respect, and the courage to change. For Jax and his gang, the journey was just beginning. But for Frank, knowing he had played even a small part in their transformation was enough. He had lived a life of service, and now, as he approached the twilight of his years, he could rest knowing that his legacy wasn't just in medals or ceremonies. It was in the lives he had touched along the way. And that, to Frank, was the greatest honor of all.